The dog didn't just run toward the collapsed mine. It dissolved into the mountain's shadow, as if swallowed whole. Elias stood frozen, the cold November air of ice on his lungs. For weeks, the one-eyed stray he called Scout had been his only consistent companion, a fellow ghost haunting the hollow. Now, the animal's frantic barks, muffled by tons of rock and earth, echoed not just in the air, but in that desolate cavern inside Elias's own chest. Every instinct, honed by 2 tours in the Korangal, screamed at him to stay out. Collapsed tunnels were graves in waiting. But the barking held a note of urgent discovery, not fear. It was the same sound a soldier makes when he's found a way through, a path no one else can see. Cursing his own foolishness, Elias squeezed through the jagged maw of the old Serenity mine, leaving the weak afternoon light behind. The air inside should have been stale, heavy with the dust of forgotten decades. Instead, it was cool and clean, carrying a faint, earthy scent like petrichor after a summer storm. His worn headlamp cut a trembling beam through the blackness, revealing the skeletal remains of shoring timbers and rusted or cart rails. Scout's barks led him deeper, past the point of collapse, through a narrow fissure he would have never noticed, a crack in the world concealed by a rockfall. He scraped his shoulders, the stone cold and unforgiving against his thin jacket. And then he was through. The tunnel opened into a space not made by man. The cavern was immense, a natural cathedral domed with glittering quartz that caught his light and threw it back as 1,000 tiny stars. The sound of Scout's joyful yelps was joined by the gentle music of moving water. In the center of the grotto, a pool of water, no larger than a baptismal font, bubbled up from the earth. It wasn't just clear, it seemed to possess its own internal light, a soft, silver-blue luminescence that pulsed in time with a rhythm he could feel in the soles of his boots. Scout was lapping at the edge, his grizzled fur already looking darker, richer. The cloudy film over his blind eye seemed to be receding, replaced by a deep, intelligent brown. Elias watched, his breath caught in his throat. This place felt ancient, sacred. He knelt, the tremor that had lived in his hands since the roadside balm, finding a sudden stillness. He saw his reflection in the water, and for the first time in years, he didn't see a ghost. He saw the face of a man who was desperately thirsty. He cupped his hands, the water cold as a mountain stream, but without the biting chill. As he drank, a profound quiet settled over him, silencing the ghosts that had screamed in his mind for 5 long years. The water tasted of stone and starlight, of deep earth and clean silence. When he rose, the chronic pain in his knee, a constant reminder of a fall from a blasted Humvee, was a dull ache, a memory rather than a reality. Scout trotted to his side and nudged his hand, his one good eye bright with a shared, unspoken knowledge. They had stumbled into a secret the mountain had kept for itself, a place of quiet restoration hidden behind a wall of ruin. Elias told no one. The secret of the spring became a silent covenant between him, the mountain, and the dog. Each morning before the sun crested the ridge, he and Scout would make the pilgrimage to the hidden grotto. He carried an old military canteen, filling it from the luminous pool. He never took more than he needed for the day. It felt wrong, like demanding a gift that was meant to be freely given. The changes were subtle at first, then undeniable. The gray in his temples seemed to retreat, and the deep carved lines of grief on his face began to soften. He started sleeping through the night, the nightmares of sand and fire receding into a manageable distance. He began to repair the sagging porch on his grandfather's cabin, the hammer blows falling with a steady, confident rhythm that echoed through the valley. Scout, for his part, was transformed. His coat grew thick and glossy, the scar over his eye faded to a thin silver line, and he moved with the fluid grace of a dog half his age. Their shared healing was a quiet miracle, a conversation conducted without words in the dappled light of the forest and the holy dark of the mine. The valley, however, remained as broken as he had been. The town of Redemption was a husk of its former self, its lifeblood drained when the coal ran out. It was a place of ghosts, where young people left and old people waited. Elias, in his self-imposed exile, had been just one more shadow among many. Now, walking through the town for supplies, he felt a painful new awareness of the quiet suffering around him. He saw it in the stooped shoulders of the men gathered outside the closed hardware store, in the weary eyes of the cashier at the market, in the faded for sale signs that dotted the landscape like tombstones. Mr. Abernathy, the proprietor of the town's last general store, was the first to notice. A man whose kindness was as weathered and sturdy as the oak counter he stood behind. He watched Elias over the rim of his spectacles. "That tremor in your hands is gone," he said one afternoon, his voice a gentle rumble. "It wasn't a question. And you're standing taller, son." Elias just nodded, his hand tightening on a sack of flour. He offered no explanation, and the old man, sensing the fragility of the change, didn't ask for one. But Abernathy's observation was a stone dropped into the still pool of Elias's secret life. That same week, a fleet of new pickup trucks rolled into town, their clean paint and corporate logos an affront to the valley's muted palate. They belonged to a development firm run by a man named Marcus Thorne, a slick operator with a predator's smile who saw the depressed land prices as an opportunity. Thorne held a town meeting, promising jobs and prosperity. He planned to reopen the mines, not with tunnels, but with explosives and massive earth movers. He spoke of reclaiming the mountain's wealth, but all Elias could hear was the language of desecration. Thorne's maps, displayed on an easel, showed a boundary line for the strip mining operation that ran perilously close to the Serenity mine. A cold dread, more potent than any fear he'd felt in combat, settled in Elias's stomach. The mountain had offered him healing, and now the world was coming to tear its heart out. A few days later, Elias saw Mr. Abernathy helping his wife, Eleanor, into their car after a doctor's appointment. The light in the old man's eyes was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out despair Elias knew all too well. Eleanor looked fragile as a dried leaf, her breath a shallow, painful labor. The whispers in town were grim. The cancer had returned, and the doctors had run out of answers. That night, Elias sat on his porch, the full moon illuminating the craggy face of the mountain. He held the cool metal of his canteen, the water inside seeming to pulse with a life of its own. He thought of his grandfather's words, long ignored. "Some things, boy, you don't take. You serve." He had been taking from the spring, hoarding its gift for himself. The thought shamed him. He remembered the face of the young private, Caleb, who had bled out in his arms, his own inaction a failure that had defined his life ever since. He would not fail again. Under the cover of darkness, he walked to the Abernathy house, Scout trotting silently at his heels. He knocked softly on the door. When Mr. Abernathy opened it, his face a mask of grief, Elias simply held out the canteen. "From an old family spring," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "My grandfather always said it had a bit of life in it. Please." For Eleanor, he didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked away, the weight of his secret now a shared burden, its fate no longer his alone to bear. The change in Eleanor Abernathy was not a sudden spectacle. It was a quiet tide turning. The next day, she sat up in bed and asked for soup. Within a week, she was walking in her garden, the color returning to her cheeks. She was not cured, but she was restored, given a reprieve that felt like a gift from heaven itself. Mr. Abernathy cornered Elias in the store, his eyes brimming with a gratitude so profound it was painful to witness. "Son," he whispered, his voice thick, "I don't know what was in that water, and I won't ask. But you brought my wife back to me." The bond between them solidified into something unbreakable, forged in a shared, sacred secret. But the world kept pressing in. Thorne surveyors appeared on the mountain, their fluorescent vests like wounds against the green landscape. They drove stakes into the ground, inching closer to the Serenity mine's sealed entrance. The threat was no longer an abstract line on a map. It was the crunch of boots on the forest floor, the clinical slice of a surveyor's transit through the trees. The town was fracturing. Thorne's promise of jobs was a powerful lure for families struggling to get by. Lifelong neighbors argued across fences, the developers' money poisoning the well of their community. Elias felt the pressure building, a familiar tightening in his chest. He was a soldier again, defending a position no one else knew existed, a hallowed ground he could not explain or surrender. His secret was both his greatest strength and his most terrible vulnerability. If he revealed the spring, the valley would be overrun not by strip miners, but by a different kind of locust, the desperate, the hopeful, the greedy, all seeking a miracle and destroying it in the process. The notice was nailed to the town hall door, a stark white rectangle against the weathered wood. Thorne's company, through a labyrinthine series of holding companies and an obscure century-old deed, had secured the mining rights to the entire western face of the mountain, including the land around the Serenity mine. A final public hearing was scheduled. It was a formality, a last box to be checked before the blasting began. That night, a storm rolled in, a violent tempest that mirrored the war in Elias's soul. Rain lashed against his cabin, and the wind howled like a grieving animal. The ghosts came back with the storm. He saw Caleb's face, young and afraid, saw the plume of dust from the IED, heard his own voice, frozen in his throat, unable to shout the warning in time. He was that man again, paralyzed by the enormity of the moment, watching as something precious was about to be obliterated. He gripped the edge of his table, the tremor returning to his hands with a vengeance. Scout rested his head on Elias's knee, whining softly, a warm, living anchor in the swirling chaos of his memory. The dog had led him to healing, but healing wasn't a destination. It was a choice, made over and over again. He had to choose now. He could retreat back into his silence, into the familiar fortress of his trauma, and let the mountain die. Or he could stand up and fight, even if it meant risking the very secret that had saved him. The choice was between his own safety and the life of the valley. The town hall was packed, the air thick with tension and the smell of damp wool. Marcus Thorne stood at the front, a portrait of confident authority in his tailored suit, pointing to charts and graphs that promised prosperity. He spoke of job creation and tax revenue, his words smooth and practiced. He was winning. Elias could feel the hope in the room shifting toward him, a desperate, exhausted community ready to believe in an easy answer. When Thorne finished, the floor was open for comment. Silence. Elias looked at the tired faces, the downcast eyes. He saw his own despair reflected back at him. Then, Mr. Abernathy slowly got to his feet, his movements deliberate. He didn't look at Thorne. He looked at Elias. Wealth isn't just what you can dig up and sell, the old man began, his voice surprisingly strong. Sometimes it's in the things you leave alone. It's in the quiet of the woods. It's in the health of your neighbors. He paused, his gaze still fixed on Elias. I've seen this valley at its best and its worst. And lately, I've seen a change for the better. I've seen it in a man who came back to us broken and is now whole. A man who learned that the best way to heal yourself is to help someone else. Every eye in the room turned to Elias. His heart hammered against his ribs. The ghost screamed at him to sit down, to stay silent. But this time, another voice rose above them, a quiet, steady voice that sounded like his grandfather's. He pushed himself to his feet, his hands shaking, and walked to the front of the room. He didn't speak of a magical spring. He spoke of his own brokenness. He told them about the quiet of the mountain, how it had given him a place to heal. Thorne is offering to sell our mountain's body, Elias said, his voice gaining strength. I'm asking if we're willing to sell its soul. He then laid out a different vision, a community trust, a nature preserve, a wellness retreat built around the valley's natural beauty, creating jobs that sustain the land instead of destroying it. It was a fragile dream against Thorne's concrete promises, but it was offered with the raw, undeniable authenticity of a redeemed man. Thorne laughed, a short, dismissive bark, but no one joined him. The seed Elias had planted, nurtured by Abernathy's wisdom, had taken root in the room. People began to talk, not of blasting schedules, but of hiking trails, not of coal seams, but of their children's futures. The legal fight would be long and arduous, but the battle for the valley's heart was won in that moment. That night, searching for something in his grandfather's dusty footlocker, Elias found an old, leather-bound journal. The faded ink described his grandfather's own discovery of the grotto decades earlier. He had found it after a mining accident, crawling through the darkness, and the water had saved his life. But fear and wisdom had guided him. Some gifts are not meant to be owned, only stewarded, his grandfather had written. To reveal it would be to destroy it. Its purpose is not to make one man rich, but to serve as a quiet reminder of grace. Tucked into the back of the journal was a folded, brittle document. The original deed for the Serenity mine, granted to his family not for mineral rights, but with a stewardship clause, legally mandating that the land be preserved in its natural state. His grandfather had sealed the mine not to hide the spring, but to protect it, fulfilling the terms of a sacred trust. It was the weapon they needed, a shield forged from integrity. 6 months later, Elias stood at the entrance to the Serenity Mine, the morning sun warming his face. Scout sat faithfully at his side, his coat of burnished gold in the new light. The legal battle, bolstered by the stewardship clause, had ended in Thorne's defeat. His trucks were gone. In their place, the sounds of hammers and saws echoed from the town below, not for destruction, but for renewal. The community trust was a reality. Volunteers were clearing old logging roads into hiking paths, and the Abernethys had donated a portion of their land for a small lodge that would form the heart of the new retreat. Elias, the man who had hidden from the world, was now the project's foreman, his quiet confidence guiding the work. The spring remained a secret, a source of quiet strength known only to a few, administered with humble discretion when the need was true. Elias reached into his pocket and closed his hand around a smooth, cool stone he had taken from the grotto. He hadn't needed the water in months. The healing was no longer in the spring, but in the purpose it had given him. He had followed a stray dog into the darkness seeking refuge and had been led back into the light, not just for himself, but for the entire valley. He had learned the deepest truth of the mountain, that redemption is not a place you find, but a thing you build, and that the only way to save yourself is to give everything you have away in service to others.